Hi guys, welcome to another Introverts Vlogs. Today we're going to be doing something different. We're working on a Harley Davidson Sportster. We're going to be removing and replacing the rear wheel and adding a spacer to the pulley. First you need to get a prying tool and pull the safety clip off and keep it aside. We then need to mark the bolt and the nut for the tensioners on both sides. This is to make sure when we replace it, we put it back to the right tension. Then you need a 14mm socket to remove the brake calipers and a flathead screwdriver to remove the screw at the top. We then get a 32mm socket, an extension bar and a breaker bar. This will help get the rear axle nut loose. We then switch over with the 32mm socket and a regular ratchet and remove the rest. Once you remove the axle nut loose, you can remove it with your hand, take the washer off and keep them both sides safe. Then we use a mallet to push the rear axle right through. You could also use a breaker bar or an extension rod to push it. As you can see, it's very difficult to pull without any tools. We then move on to removing the caliper and moving it aside so we can have space to work. Remember to push the pistons back on the caliper when you put it aside. There are spacers on either side, so when you remove the axle completely, the spacers will drop. Do not be alarmed, you can keep them aside safe as well. We then use a smaller socket to remove the tensioner and make it loose. After that, you can move the belt aside and the wheel is free to come off. As you can see here, I'm using a bike stand to keep both wheels off the ground. This made the job a lot easier. You could also use a bike stand or a scissor jack to lift the bike off the ground. What I'm doing is removing the previous pulley that I've replaced and adding a spacer. So here is the old factory pulley. I'm measuring the distance, the offset from the wheel hub to the outside face of the pulley. Then I'm placing the new pulley that I've bought, and you can see that there's a gap on the offset, so I'm using a spacer that I've bought separately. Here I'm using a 0.500 inch spacer, which is a 12.7 millimeter. This spacer gives me the right amount of offset compared to the factory pulley. We then clean the thread of every bolt, add some red Loctite and secure them. Make sure to be quick before the Loctite sets. This is to stop the bolts from coming loose due to vibration. We are now greasing the spacers for both sides and the axle rod. Make sure it's clean before re-greasing it. Make sure there's no debris or dust. Once the tire is in position, place both spacers on either side and gently lift the tire up onto a block as I'm using here, or a lift. Then reinstall the belt over the pulley. Also make sure to reinstall the brake caliper. Be sure that both the pads are on either side of the disc. Once that is secure, we are now ready to put the axle rod back on. When replacing the axle rod, be sure to use plenty of grease and have a good even layer. This will help keep the wheel moving smoothly as well as with the installation. Now that we are ready to reinstall, gently push the axle rod through the right side of the bike. Make sure to adjust the tensioner and use a mallet to push the axle rod completely through. Make sure the spacers do not fall off. Now we work back by adding the washer and the axle rod nut, and we hand tighten it. We then use a breaker bar and the 32mm socket to tighten it again. Be sure to use a torque wrench and tighten it to the torque specs according to the Harley Davidson manual. Also, once you're done, reinstall the safety clip to the end of the axle rod. You can use a mallet to gently knock the clip back onto the axle rod and secure it. Spin the wheel a few times to make sure the wheel is spinning evenly and straight. Once the axle is secure, use the ruler and the measurement you took earlier when removing the tensioner. This will help you adjust the tension on both sides to the original spec. Be sure to double check, tighten the nut on each side. Be sure to tighten it evenly on either side and keep going back and forth to check to make sure the length is identical to before you removed it. This will help avoid over tensioning the belt and causing further damage, as well as to make sure the wheel is aligned and the axle is straight. Once you have double checked, make sure to replace the rubber cap back onto the nut. Now that everything is done, we go over every bolt that we removed, make sure it's tightened and torqued to spec. Refer to the Harley Davidson manual to find the correct torque specs for each bolt. Now the bike is done and ready for the road. Also, if the bike is on a stand, start the bike and put it into first and check the wheel is spinning straight and freely.